It's really my privilege to welcome you to this series, as this is the kickoff workshop of the set of 3. And we're really delighted to see such, diversity of faces and countries and disciplines and centers represented here. It's my pleasure to introduce Edgar Pieterse, the Director of the African Centre for Cities and the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy.
So the first point to make, of course, is that the African Urban Research Initiative is still relatively young, and we have a relatively small footprint on the continent. And this is both reflective of the challenges of doing this kind of work, but also of the underinvestment in our fields across the higher education system in Africa. And this is a rather frightening prospect if we consider the scope and scale of urbanization at the moment. And by the time you will all be crusty professors in 30 years' time, you will, at that point, we would have more than doubled the urban population. And so if you think of your career and the fact of what we're dealing with today and what we've got to solve over the next 20, 30 years, it's a rather frightening prospect. And we do need to recognize that we are very much at the margin of that system. The second point to make is that, AURI has always been intended to be a very flexible and a very open learning platform. And so this is a safe space where we can, as African scholars, talk to each other openly and in a sort of a supportive manner, and really wrestle both with the field, with the concepts, with the ideas, with the theories and the methodological challenges of doing our work, but also wrestle with the institutional complexities of building a discipline, a field, and strengthening our presence on the continent. And so it is both about substance, but it's also about institutional solidarity and support and learning. Now, the fact that most African governments now have accepted that urbanization is a valid domain of policy making, that national urban policy instruments are required, and that we need active policy intermediation spaces where cities and national governments can interface and try and figure out how to address the myriad of urban challenges. That's very recent. Just a decade ago, most African governments were not there. They weren't thinking it's a priority. In fact, they were just thinking of it as a problem. And so our work and our scholarship comes at a moment that in the public policy domain, there is a very recent realization that there's a whole set of issues to be understood and engaged with and so forth. And so we've got an extraordinary responsibility to both be supportive of those policy processes, but also, of course, be the custodians of independence and rigor, and speaking truth to power and making sure that policy processes are in fact evidence-based. And so how we do that in a context of relatively under-resourced institutions and often a political environment that is not appreciative of independence is something, again, that we need to learn together and that we need to share our stories. And then my final point is just that in kind of becoming this next-gen academic, if you will, or 21st century scholar, obviously really, and the sort of demands of that means that solidarity and peer support and peer learning is absolutely fundamental. And so I just really want to encourage everyone to see the potential value of this platform and to embrace this opportunity to sort of get to know your peers and your colleagues and to please, bring your energy and your commitment and your own willingness to be that peer for someone else into the space. And so thanks again for all the organizers, and I really hope you have a fantastic workshop or series of workshops.
Next up, we'll have 2 inputs, one from the City Lab, the Dar es Salaam City Lab team. We are very happy to have Dr. Priscilla Izar and her colleague Wamaka Lucas Mwanglinga here, who's specifically a communication specialist, and they will be sharing some of their work And then next up, we will have Zarina Patel, who's an associate professor at the Department of the Environmental and Geographical Science at UCT, and her colleague in the city of Cape Town, Amy Davidson.
I'm Priscilla Zar, and I'm a postdoc researcher at the Institute for Human Settlement Studies at AURI University in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, although I'm now based in South Africa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gomaka, and I'm Communication Officer at City Lab. I'll be joining Dr. Priscilla in today's presentation. It's really nice to meet you all.
We were very intrigued by this relationship between communication and the sharing of research. And at the City Lab, it's created as a space for debate about the transformation of Dar es Salaam. We address it not as a single issue or as a way to share research, but really it frames our research. We can present communication as narrative, as a tool for learning, and as a tool for sharing knowledge. And we've been operating for about 3 years. And the narrative that we are working with in Dar es Salaam specifically, it is a city that's expanding fast, that doubles in terms of the population and the urban footprint every 10 years. It is still, Tanzania is just about 30% urbanized, so there's a lot to come still. But whereas the prominent narrative is of a city that needs to structure itself to in terms of space and administration and finances to attract global capital, we are looking at what happens every day in the prominent territories of Dar es Salaam, that's 70% informal, and where most of the development is occurring.
Women to Watch is an experiment project done by the City Lab. It involves a shadowing program where we have young female professionals and practitioners following more senior females from the local communities. When I talk about local communities, we focused more on Akeko Machungwa communities. Aims of the Women to Watch project was to strengthen the capacity of Tanzanian women, both in formal and informal sector, while gathering and recorded data about gender, labor, and urban transformation, so as we can disseminate it in a broader audience. But also we aim to train young Tanzanian women through observation and shadowing on how senior women navigate in their daily life.
Naitwa Janet Primo, mkazi wa hapa Keko Machungwa na ni mwana federation, ni fundi wa tofali za interlocking. Kwa hapa mimi nilikuwa nafyatua hizi tofali na tunajenga choo hichi na wanafunzi hao wa chuo cha ardhi ambao wameomba tuwasaidie wao kama wanajifunza kuhusu, wanataka kujua toka tofali zinavyofyatuliwa mpaka vyoo hivyo vinavyojengwa vinajengwaje. Kwa hiyo tuko nao wao sisi federation kwa kupitia CCI.
Kwa jina naitwa Esther. I'm a graduate katika Professional Urban and Regional Planning. Nipo hapa kama volunteer as a mentee katika hii project ya Women to Watch, na niko hapa ku-watch ni shughuli ambazo zinafanywa na wanawake ambazo ni pamoja na hii construction ya toilets. Na katika hii project nimefurahia kwa sababu nimejifunza vitu vingi sana, ambapo moja ya kitu ambacho nimejifunza ni pamoja na construction ya toilets, kitu ambacho kiko nje kabisa ya professional yangu na kiko katika professional za watu wengine kama engineers na architect.
Kwa hiyo mtumiaji sasa anapokuja akijisaidia, kinyesi kinaenda pale kwenye udongo, na kwa sababu tumeotesha minyoo kule, minyoo ile inakuja inakula, kisha inapumzika ikijisaidia ni mbolea. Kwa hiyo baada ya kama miezi 3-4 mtagundua kuna vichuguu huko pembeni, kwa maana sasa ni kile kinyesi cha minyoo ndio ambacho tutakuwa tunakitumia badala ya kinyesi cha binadamu.
Furahi sana.
Jina langu naitwa Tatu Salumu Mkagile, naishi Keko Machungwa, na umri wa miaka 74. Na furaha kwa kuchimbiwa choo na ndugu zangu walionipa msaada, na washukuru vijana wangu.
With Women to Watch, what we started with was we created first a space for debate. And that's when the first phase of Women to Watch. Women to Watch is divided into 3 phases. Now we created a space for debate where we invited women from different parts of Africa. We had women from Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, and in Tanzania we had local community members coming in. We had academics, we had young professional graduates. So they all came together and we chose a topic to discuss. We spoke about how do women live, work, and transform environment in African cities. So there was a huge discussion on the topic where we gathered a lot of information. We had a lot of documentation of the information that was provided. And later on, after the discussion, this gave away for a new Women to Watch phase 2. Like you have seen the video about the young women and the local and the senior women from community called Keko Machungwa. So working with these women at a local community, we had to build a toilet. Now the toilet was more like a means to bring these young women and these local community women together so they can learn from each other. They can shadow one another and gather information. We gather data in order to understand how they live, how they navigate through their daily activities. We prepared a presentation, we sat down, and then we learned that, okay, some stuff have come up, so we need to meet again. So this discussion, this conversation that we had gave a new idea to start a Women to Watch phase 3. We've learned a lot more about the women that were involved at Keko Machungwa. We've gathered pure gender-based data at Keko Machungwa through the means of communication. So communication is a key at City Lab, and we use it as a tool for different activities that we do at City Lab.
We feel that we've been very successful with learning. Like we are learning a lot about the different territories and communities that we are working, and we feel that there is we've been able in these 2 years to have a horizontal learning structure going on. We trust each other. We have created this space for debate, like Wamaka was saying. We feel that we are gathering information that we can eventually share. What we feel that we are still coming short is in changing the narrative to our peer lecturers, researchers, academics, and policymakers. There is a lot of space for oral history and movies. This is also something that became even more clear with the COVID crisis. This need to reach out to different audiences. Mapping, both mapping in terms of raising awareness about issues, but also for the population to see themselves on the map. But again, this is something to go in parallel to the more traditional peer-reviewed journals and books, because there is a space for them, and I think it's this just being able to change the narrative.
Next up, we have Zarina Patel and Amy Davidson, who will share a little bit about their work on co-production and co-writing research.
So I'm going to speak a little bit on this slide just to introduce the project to you. So the project was part of the Mistra Urban Futures Programme, which was a huge international program with 5 different cities across the world looking at how to co-produce knowledge for urban sustainability transitions. Cape Town was one of the platforms, as I said, and there were other platforms in other places, Gothenburg, Kisumu, Manchester. So in Cape Town, we had a partnership between the University of Cape Town, the African Centre for Cities specifically, and the City of Cape Town. And of course, this partnership between the ACC and the City of Cape Town was not brand new in 2012, but was predated. So there was a history to co-producing knowledge and working together in a partnership between the city and the university. One of the things we were trying to do in the knowledge transfer program was to break down this sort of mode 1 knowledge transfer between the university and the city, really recognizing that complex issues need complex responses and multiple actors need to be involved in coming up with responses to these questions. The knowledge transfer program was an attempt to have the city and the university drive urban change collectively and together. And the assumption here was that in order to get better policy, we could have more defensible policy if it was backed up, evidence-based policy, having the research behind it, but also having some sort of theoretical background in order to kind of legitimize some of the policy positions at the city. Another aim of the program was to conduct scholarship, PhDs, publications, etc., in a move that universities are moving towards more social responsiveness and engaged scholarship. So this is a move to a different kind of more democratic knowledge scholarship production. We didn't have a communication strategy, but what we did have was a co-production strategy. And co-production, what we realized in putting the presentation together and through the work that we did, was that co-production is absolutely about communicating across institutional lines, communicating across different epistemologies and ways of thinking about issues.
We had a program which we called City Officials Exchange, in which a number of officials over the course of a few years were given the opportunity to take 8 weeks of work approved by the HR department to go be at UCT and to work with an academic co-writer to write up an aspect of their work as a academic paper for publication in a journal, and then later on there was a book that came out. And that was really something very innovative. That's something which we'd never done before as the city, giving staff time off to reflect and think about their work in a different way and think through the implications in terms of the sort of the current literature in the field. And so that was really very innovative and very well appreciated by the staff that were involved. I think from the city's perspective, the value of the approach was that through this program, we had an opportunity to work directly with researchers on matters of importance. And then maybe later on you get some paper that they've written back. But frequently the results of the research don't really feed back into government work and don't really feed back into the policy process.
Great. So from the university side, the way in which the program ran was that we had what was called the Embedded Researcher Program. And we had 4 PhD students, mature students, who were embedded in different departments within the city as a way of doing their PhD research, but also supporting and working with city officials on specific policy issues. So we had someone working in the green economy, someone in energy governance, someone in climate adaptation, and one of the researchers working in the space economy. So they were embedded in different departments for 7 months at a time over a 3-year period. And the way in which each of the embedded researchers went about doing their work really depended on the history of the policy issue that they were looking at. And the kinds of communication strategies that they used within the city and the ways in which they interfaced with policy really depended on the area that they were working in. But this multiple genres that Edgar spoke about was absolutely core to the way to communication. So op-eds, blogs, position papers, sometimes policy briefs, as well as writing scholarly articles and doing PhDs. So it's a huge ask of embedded PhD researchers working in a very different way, but talking to a variety of different audiences and disseminating their work to a range of different audiences and switching registers all the time. So in terms of the value of the approach for the embedded researchers, there are a few things I can say here. I mean, there is certainly new knowledge and access to knowledge that they would never have had if they had come in to do a 1-hour interview with the city official. The kind of access to knowledge, the city's resources, etc., being able to move in and out of different council meetings and meetings that were happening, and having firsthand experience of how decisions get made, was really invaluable, an invaluable process. So the tacit knowledge of how the city operates, the logics and the cultures behind how the city operates were really one of the biggest values of being embedded as researchers.
I'll just briefly speak a bit to challenges and opportunities, again, from the city's perspective. I'm just conscious of time. So time being the first one on that slide, I think is quite important. This is obviously something that takes longer than just a normal research process. In fact, any type of co-production approach is obviously going to take longer than just a normal approach of sort of transmitting knowledge. So I think that's something to consider. It's potentially a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity because it gives people more time to engage. I think power dynamics is a very important issue that came up several times in this work. You know, of who holds the power. Is it government? Is it academia? And in fact, both have different kinds of power. And I think there was experience from both sides that there was a feeling that the other institution was sort of maybe the more knowledgeable about certain topics. But ultimately, one of the things that we found was a really good way of sort of short-circuiting some of those power dynamics was the introduction of a third space. That was physically a third space as well as sort of mentally a third space. So a third space theoretically in terms of working together to produce co-produced outputs, but also setting up meetings away from either city buildings or university buildings, meeting in a sort of neutral space on equal terms. Went a long way towards sort of diffusing some of the power dynamics.
I think another point around time is the very different rhythms with which by which the city and the university operate. So the university is a kind of the long, big think, whereas the city works on a crisis management timescale, and everything's very urgent and very quick. So it's a very different rhythm that there's very different rhythms that had to be reconciled. Another point in terms of the power dynamics, another way in which we trying to diffuse power dynamics was around the way in which the project was governed. So we had a project steering committee and a project advisory committee, both of which had equal numbers from the city and the university, and there was also shared leadership in both of these structures. So that was, and that also was fluid and changed from meeting to meeting. So that was a really important part of diffusing the power dynamics as well. So in terms of multiple hats, the city officials, the embedded researchers, as you can see from the photographs, it's really impossible to distinguish who's a city official and who's an academic. They look the same, they speak the same. There are many things that are very similar, but they're also epistemologically very different. So these embedded researchers, because they were both insiders and outsiders, were often called upon to be involved in processes and issues that they weren't necessarily part of their kind of brief when they came into the city. But because they were adaptable and eager and keen, they got involved in many, many different things and got pulled in many directions. So this question of leadership and supervision and how to earmark the kind of boundaries of your work is really challenging in a program like this.
So really, and these I think are things that you can apply to the practical exercises that are going to be happening today, is relevance or salience, I think, being one of the primary important factors to consider. when communicating with government. People are very busy. As Serena has mentioned, there's always some kind of crisis happening. Decisions need to be made quickly. There's very specific times of the year where there's budget cycles and where there's program management happening that are very set times of the year, and that can't be changed. I think fit was something which we really found quite important in this program. Is there's sometimes really important research that it needs to be done, but it doesn't necessarily fit with what the city is interested in. There's maybe nobody who's doing any work that's related to that at the current time, and that also fits in with timing. That it's if it's not the right time, that doesn't mean that it's not a really good piece of work or something interesting or something which needs to be engaged with, but that it may not really be the right time or the right fit. And that's sort of just, I think, an inherent consequence of working across different organizations that have very different sort of timescales and ways of managing time.
In terms of the researchers themselves, as well as the city officials who came to the university, I think that what's also very important is the kinds of the interpersonal skills that people who are doing this kind of work need to have, because it's not just about your academic prowess or the number of policy processes you've been involved in, but if you aren't able to communicate across divides, that becomes extremely difficult. So your communication abilities and being able to work with other people, because this is a relational space, it is about relating to one another, is really, really critical. So the agility of researchers and city officials in communicating with one another is quite important.
Speaking as a government official, it's very hard for us to access academic work, actually, unless it's been made freely available. We don't have subscriptions to journals or all of these online journals. So unless you are working directly with an academic who will send you a copy of it, you often don't see the academic outputs.
One thing that was really surprising to us is that the beginning, and it was more sort of like a research project, was to look at the relationship between gender and urban production. And we were shocked with the reaction of the audience, of how much they wanted to talk about inequality of women and opportunities for young women.
As long as we're trying to do something different, but still working in a conventional science system, we are going to hit these walls about what is success and what is impact.
So just to say thank you to everyone for attending, for sticking with us. Thank you so much to, in their absence, the presenters for their I see Priscilla's still here, for our lovely presenters for their input, who really sparked, the conversation as we all think about how we communicate to our different audiences.
Thank you, Alma. Thank you, Marcela. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.